Hello and welcome. This is episode 151 of That Shakespeare Life. Today's episode is brought to you by Experience Shakespeare. Experience Shakespeare is the membership arm of That Shakespeare Life that offers you monthly digital history activity kits that let you try at home the history you learn about on the show. They work like science labs for history. Stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Michael Rowan Robinson. I'm an astronomer and interested in cosmology and infrared astronomy. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Jordan was a term for what a physician would use. And they would do uroscopy and look at somebody's pee. And so a Jordan was a term for this glass flask, kind of like a light bulb, spherical at one end and then this cylindrical tube that came out.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Surviving archaeological items from the first English settlements in Jamestown include intact chamber pots. One of these chamber pots was part of a 2009 exhibit at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., United States. These pots were brought over to the New World by 16th, 17th century colonists who, at the time, used chamber pots as essential items. However, when they arrived, the colonists were surprised to discover that the natives did not have the same sanitary system as they did back in England, and by consequence, did not have streets running with open sewage as the colonists were accustomed to seeing. Despite the Romans having developed a sophisticated system for water sanitation and disposal of waste, the English of Shakespeare's lifetime did not continue that progress. For Shakespeare's entire life and many years prior, sanitation and cleanliness was misunderstood, sometimes feared, and certainly not well practiced in 16th century England. The sanitation of Shakespeare's lifetime functions as an example of when technology did not continue to progress past the Romans, but instead absolutely digressed to truly gross levels. Excrement was collected in chamber pots or sometimes just in an open area whenever someone happened to find the need to relieve themselves. Once collected, it would be disposed of by throwing it out the window and into the street below. It was not uncommon for passersby to be hit with the falling urine or feces if they weren't careful. In 1591, a godson of Elizabeth I and a member of her royal court proposed a new idea and a much cleaner way to handle things. Sir John Harington would write The Metamorphosis of Ajax. Ajax is a slang term for a place to go to the bathroom, in which he included a detailed engineering diagram and instructions for applicable use on the first ever flush toilet. Here today to tell us about the history of chamber pots in England, John Harington's design, and how this revolutionary piece of technology was received during Shakespeare's lifetime is our guest, Bob Cromwell. Bob Cromwell is the author of the article, The History of the Flush Toilet, and lead historian at toiletguru.com. Bob's work has led him to document plumbing in 24 countries, through to the Neolithic era to spacecraft and several writers and artists in addition to Shakespeare. Bob holds a PhD and has worked as a consultant for the Folger Shakespeare Library. Find more about Bob in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Bob. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I've really been looking forward to this.
When an Elizabethan used a chamber pot, was this an item that they kept only at home with them, or did they take it with them when they traveled too?
It would depend on which Elizabethans, I suppose.
Ah, okay.
And of course, back then, people didn't go on vacations. There would be travel for work. And if you were traveling, you would expect where you stayed, the inn where you stayed, that would be a part of the furniture, that would be a part of the room that you were staying in. An exception to that would be the king or queen, because they had their own very special one and somebody to operate the thing for them. Like everything else with the king and the queen, things were different.
Prior to the England of Shakespeare's lifetime, the Romans, who occupied that part of the world, had built a substantial water supply system and a sophisticated water sanitation system, including sewers similar to what we think of today.
Yeah.
We think of technology as being this thing that constantly trends upward over time. So it's really surprising, I think, that this technological advancement existed before Shakespeare's lifetime, but then by the time we're talking about the life of William Shakespeare, this isn't there for England. Why is it that they didn't keep this advancement?
Or even notice it and say, hey, we figured out what this is. We need to rebuild this or restart this. And, I think it was the lack of the Romans, the lack of the Roman Empire, the administration. They're operating these things because they weren't just something you could build and say, well, okay, there, it's done and it'll just work forever. That this needed maintenance. And, the Roman Empire didn't just suddenly collapse in one day or over a weekend or something like that. It really faded out. And particularly in Britain, that was out on the fringe anyway. It was a long process of, and you can't point at a time and say, well, this was the exact end of it. The soldiers that were on Hadrian's Wall or the people operating the baths at Bath, they intermarried with the local people. They became gradually less Roman over time. But then there just wasn't the support for operating these things. And they talk about the Dark Ages because we don't know all that much about them. But they were dark in some other senses. It was a gloomy time. It was a time without the good technology. To some extent, it wasn't like there wasn't anything at all. An example would be at monasteries and like at Glastonbury, the monastery there. And if you visit Glastonbury, you can actually see this, and it's kind of mysterious, that there's this water channel and it splits into two parallel ones and then comes back together. It's what they called back then, they called the necessarium.
Oh, that's where we get the necessaries.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that comes from the Romans. And you had to have one of these things. If you had a whole monastery full of monks, you're going to need something that would operate at scale, and that was the necessarium. And I think it was in the 1800s that people got a little bit squeamish. If you call it a necessarium and then you think about it, you realize what it is. And, we need a different name. So they started calling these things reredators.
That's easier.
Yeah. And the dorter was a term for what we'd call a dormitory today. And re meant in back of. So, yeah, they changed the name to reredator, the thing behind the dormitory. Well, that was a name that people wouldn't be quite so squeamish over. And that was operating until Henry VIII shut down the monasteries.
In Henry IV, Part 1, Act 2, Scene 1, the second carrier speaks a line that says, if they aren't provided a Jordan, which is a slang term for a chamber pot, then they will use the chimney for their bathroom. Bob, was this a common practice for men to use the fireplace as a restroom in the home?
Yes, I'm afraid it was.
That's nasty.
Yeah, at home, or they were somebody else's place. They were staying at an inn.
Oh, wow. See, I thought it was bad enough when they did this at their own home, but they would do this at when they stayed somewhere too?
Well, and that's the setting of that scene. They're these freight haulers, these carriers, and they've stayed for the night at this place that's just an absolute dump. And they're going on about how the guy who it used to be nice, the guy who used to run the place, it's not like it used to be. And that guy died, and the new owner, the food is awful. It's as dank as a dog, they say. There's just this epic flea infestation. And on top of everything else, they didn't get a Jordan. And there's actually three things in that one line that has to do with the toilets, the sanitation of the age. So yeah, Jordan was a term for what a physician would use. And they would do uroscopy and look at somebody's pee. And so a Jordan was a term for this glass flask, kind of like a light bulb, a spherical at one end, and then this cylindrical tube that came out. And I was looking into some of this, and there's the groom of the king's stool is the official position for the person who maintained the king's toilet. And I think we'll get more into that later. But, that was the ultimate position in the court. There's a Wikipedia page that has a list of the men who had this and pages about many of them. One of them, there was actually a picture. And it was the groom of King Henry VII's closed stool. And so here's this drawing of this king laying in this bed. And there's about 15 men standing around the bed. And most of them are named. And one of them was this figure. And then there's 3 of them that are just described as physicians. And every one of those physicians, he's a physician because he's holding this glass flask. And originally, it was just something that the doctor would have. But then by Shakespeare's time, it had become, like you said, a slang term. And then he says, yeah, they won't give us this. We'll show them. We'll leak in their chimney. And then he goes on to say something about a chamber lie. And I was mystified by that and found out that, that was a specialized term for a chamber pot that was used just to collect urine and collect it. And you think, well, why would you want to collect it? Why wouldn't you just want to get rid of it? Well, it was used for cleaning and for laundry. And somewhere like an inn, you have a lot of guests coming through, you have a lot of sheets you need to clean. You're going to need a lot of pee to do that back in the day. People didn't know too much about chemistry at the time. And so lye was a broader term back then. Nowadays you'd say, well, lye is something you can get by soaking ashes in water, and you get potassium hydroxide out of that, or sodium hydroxide. Urine with a lot of ammonia was also used for cleaning. And so collectively, all those things were called lye. And so I don't know. Searching for some rationale, why would you think it's okay to just pee into the fireplace? Maybe you're thinking, well, it's all lye.
So it's all there anyway because of the soot and the ash, and they just think all of this goes together. It's not going to hurt anything. Okay. Bob's research cites a line from All's Well That Ends Well, Act 5, Scene 2, where the clown talks about Parolles' letter smelling like used toilet paper. Bob, if the 16th century English did not use toilet, does this line mean that they did use toilet paper?
Maybe the king or the very wealthy. Paper was still, more of an artisanal rather than industrial product. And paper was just enormously expensive. So, the cheapest thing was water in your hand. Maybe you'd have some old rags, maybe some plant material, leaves, tree bark, whatever. The way the Romans built their toilets was you would sit on this long bench. It was very communal. And, you'd be in there with like 20 other people. Well, it'd be the place to hang out and gossip and so on. And in the Roman system, you were sitting over a channel of moving water. So the waste was taken away. They weren't nasty, smelly places. But then down at your feet was sort of like a gutter that you'd have on the edge of the roof of your house, cut down into the stone floor, and there was water that flowed through that gutter. And there was your water for cleaning. And there would typically be sticks with sponges on them. And so you could ask somebody, hey, pass me the tersorium, pass me down the cleaning sponge.
That line also refers to a closed stool. Bob, is this reference to a particular kind of chamber pot or Jordan, like we talked about with the physicians? Was there a different shape?
Oh boy, is there. It would be the thing that I think anybody would want, because otherwise the chamber pot is this pot that sits on the floor and you're going to have to squat over this thing. It's going to be difficult. You need a good balance, and it's going to be a strain on your knees. So the idea of a closed stool looks like a wooden box and comes up about knee high, and there's a cushion on the top of it. You could just sit on the thing. Well, if you lift up, the lid is hinged and it opens up and there's a hole. And so the chamber pot would go into the closed stool, into that box. And then if you didn't want to, or you weren't able to clean it right away, well, you could close the lid and nobody has to look at it or smell it as much. I would think a lot of people would want to put together something along those lines. Now, the king's was a big deal. And like I was saying, there was a figure who would be the groom of the king's closed stool, was the full title of this. And that was actually the most powerful non-royal person in the kingdom. That was the person that would sit there with the king and talk to him while he sat on the toilet. And it had to be just completely trusted, very close to the king in several ways. And they would help the king with the toilet and get him into his underwear. And then there was another set of grooms that would take over getting the king dressed in his outerwear and so on. And that was what I mentioned when you talk about people traveling. Well, if the king went on a trip, his closed stool and his groom for that came along as part of the entourage.
Not everyone was well pleased with the chamber pot or stool set up for bathrooms goings, and that includes one of Elizabeth I's godchildren, Sir John Harington, who in 1596 wrote a book describing what has been called the design for the first flush toilet. Bob, was this in actuality the first flush toilet, or had the Romans already developed this design previously?
Oh, the Romans were 2,000 to 3,000 years late to the game.
Really? So this had been around. So John Harington is kind of rethinking through something that had already been done.
There were some things he did that were, I think, novel. But yeah, a flushing toilet in Britain or off the coast of Britain, up off the north coast of Britain, there are the Orkney Islands. And there's a settlement there from around 3000 BC. And what the best interpretation of this is a toilet with a drain, an indoor toilet, which wintertime in Orkney could be pretty harsh and you wouldn't want to go outside. And so the people had built these sort of, they look like igloos almost, and this settlement of 8 of these clustered igloo looking buildings, and you get into them and there's a main room and it's all built from the local stone, and there's storage cabinets and there's sort of fences around beds and so on. And there's a little chamber off to the side that connects to a drain. The best guess, the best interpretation is that was a flushing toilet. Now, there were ones about that same time in today's India that were more clearly a centralized, the city built and operated a waste drainage system. The Minoans in Crete and on Santorini or Thera, I think that was maybe about 1200 BC. They had flushing toilets. So, the Romans came along after all that. Now, what Harington had was the washdown, they call it. So instead of it just being a hole with a water channel down below it or just a pit, he had a thing that he called a cistern, which, is what people still call the tank on the back of the toilet or up on the wall, the cistern. It washed into this kind of big funnel under the seat. And so it could potentially be a lot cleaner.
You mentioned that it was called the washdown. I had heard that Harington's design specifically became known as a washdown bowl, and that Elizabeth I, despite her seeming indignation at the allegorical meaning behind his writing, that she had actually had one of these washdown bowls installed in her palace at Richmond. Bob, can you confirm if she actually did that and whether the toilet is still there today?
I just have to assume that she did. I've read that in multiple places. I haven't been there. I'm pretty sure that it no longer exists, or I would imagine there'd be pictures of it all over the internet.
The book that Harington wrote was called Metamorphosis of Ajax and was perhaps intentionally an attacking allegory against Robert Dudley at the time it was written. But the design that he wrote presented engineering diagrams down to a minutia of detail with illustrations, and we'll include some of these pictures in today's show notes. But when we look at these drawings, it does appear that this flush toilet could be functional. Bob, was this design for a flush toilet installed anywhere in England? I read that Harington may have had one installed.
Yeah, what I've read about in England was his and his godmother's, Queen Elizabeth. I've read that a form of it became a little more successful in France, that some were built there. The thing is, it was going to be limited as to how popular it ever got, because there wasn't a connection to a sewer system. There wasn't a way to take the waste away. And so in his description, and it's what I'm from the States, I would call it a Rube Goldberg diagram. And in England, a Heath Robinson diagram of here's this, looks like it's overly complicated diagram of this thing with all these parts called out with letters and numbers and explanations and so on. And you sort of read this thing, you're reading down the page and you're sort of reading the system from top to bottom, and it ends up with the waste tank. And so there's this tank of water at the bottom that, it may be like the size of a bathtub or something like this. And he says, you need to clean that thing out twice a day. And you'd have to dump out all the contents, clean it as needed, put fresh water into it. It's kind of like how come the Roman sewer systems quit working. It's going to take a lot of work to do that.
So it was definitely a lot more work than anyone was used to when they're used to just pouring it out the window and not having to clean things. It probably seemed really complicated at the time.
I have this idea that Elizabeth probably said, well, this is kind of interesting. And, I'm the queen. I can do what I want. I can call for somebody to build some crazy thing and they'll do it. Let's see how this thing works.
Sure.
But then she would have thought, well, why am I going to bother with that when I have this closed stool system?
Why mess with what works?
Yeah. And Harrington's mother was one of her chamber ladies. I don't know that she was the favorite that would sit next to the queen while she was on the toilet, but she was pretty close to that position.
Well, I know we would love to explore this history further and take a look at the life of John Harrington and the evolution of the toilet in 16th century England. What are some of your favorite books or resources you can recommend we use to learn more?
They're kind of thin on the ground. You go looking for books about toilets and they tend to be pretty lowbrow and collections of jokes to read in the bathroom or jokey things about bathrooms. There's a little scholarly stuff out there. Rose George wrote a book called The Big Necessity that I thought did a good job of explaining why public health needs sanitation systems and so on. And through history and covering the historical development of it. There's a couple of books that describe really the appearance of the flush toilet in homes in the 1800s. And, the thing is, Harrington invented a lot of people had invented different things, but the big advance in this was the trap or the airlock. And so there was a Scottish inventor, Cummings, and he invented this. And if you look to the side of your toilet, you'll probably see the shape of this thing. And, you look in the bowl and there's this hole at the bottom, but then the pipe does a 180 turn and goes up, and then it does another 180 degree turn and comes down again. And that means that in the lower part of that, there's always water. And so air can't come up out of the septic system. And until that S-shaped trap got invented, nobody's going to want to connect to a sewer system because it's just going to bring all that sewer gas into your house.
Yes. Okay.
It was the 1800s that it really caught on. There's a book called Bogs, Baths, and Basins that has a good description of that development in Britain. And then for the U.S. side of things, there's one called All the Modern Conveniences.
Those are great resources. We will link to these books as well as a few scholarly articles and, of course, to Bob Cromwell's article on the history of the flush toilet, all in the show notes for today's episode. So make sure you stop by there to learn more. Now, Bob, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
I'd say The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. But feel free to notice the Hamlet's allusion in there.
Oh, yes. Well, we're very proud to see that. So you'll be well set up on your deserted island with that selection. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, the last time I got to Washington, D.C. before COVID, I went to the Folger to see what was the the exhibit that they had out, and it was right as they were closing down to start the big reconstruction project there at the Folger Library. But then I went back and talked to somebody about getting credentialed as a reader. So when I'd done some consulting work there a few years ago, one of the books that the guy I was working with had shown to me, and now we're actually getting insights related to what I do for a living. He had shown me some books that they had about cryptography. And there was one in particular, just a fascinating book by one of the members of the court of King Charles II. And so he had developed this cryptographic system. And it's an interesting book. It's beautifully done because he was doing it for the king. So there's only, I think the Folger has one, and I think Yale has a copy, and those are the only 2 copies of it in North America. Beautifully done, multicolored ink to explain things. But at the same time, it's a really good demonstration of what Edgar Allan Poe wrote about. Poe was really into cryptography and how it's so easy to come up with a system that seems really complicated and you think it must be very, very safe, but then somebody can just come along and break it very easily. I'd like to publish a paper on that.
That sounds exciting.
That's my academic post-COVID goal.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing that and reading your work on cryptography for sure. Bob Cromwell, thank you so much for being here and taking us through the history of flush toilets. This was fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Find links to more information on John Harrington, Elizabeth's toilet at Richmond, and some bonus information on the word Ajax and Ajax, a phrase about toilets that Shakespeare uses in his plays, as well as links to Bob's research on the history of flush toilets, all packed into today's show notes at CassidyCash.com/EP151. That's CassidyCash.com/EP151. Don't forget that the video version of our show is now streaming on our YouTube channel. You can find that at youtube.com/c/CassidyCash. And if you would like to have all the video versions of our show, along with documentaries, animated plays, and more, be sure to check out the streaming app for That Shakespeare Life at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for being here. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.